Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty. And I'm so grateful to God how He keeps these divine appointments, like I just said a few minutes ago to Brian, because He keeps bringing people I would never meet without having formed this YouTube ministry channel. So I'm so grateful for Brian Godawa, who was able to find time in his busy schedule for all of us tonight. I want to introduce Brian by saying that he's a very gifted book author, a very prolific one as well. He's a filmmaker, he's an apologist. I can say he's a theologian, he's also a public speaker, and all of this he's successfully doing and contributing when it comes to building the kingdom. And I'm so thankful to have you, Brian, tonight. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Nicola. Wait, how do you say that? Nicola?
Yes, Nicola.
Correct. Nicola. Well, thank you for saying my last name the only correct way that anyone has ever said it, because of our some kind of European connection going on there. My Polish name, which is Godawa, it actually is Godawa. But I know the Polish pronunciation original is that, and no one's ever said that. So
Good.
Nicola.
I got like a positive point in your book. Brian, before we start talking about one of your books, can you please give us some spiritual and theological background when it comes to your upbringing, church denomination you go to, what made you switch careers and going from being a filmmaker to writing books about gods with all this, God and gods with all these supernatural topics, and how did you find people in your congregation responding to all of these topics?
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's a big one. So I've always been an artist. I started out more as a visual artist when I was younger, and like an illustrator, that kind of a graphic designer, that kind of a thing. And when I was young and in college, and that was the day job that I had when I got out of college. And so I've always been an artist, and that's important because I've kind of always seen the world through that lens, sort of a different perspective than most people around me, type of thing. When I was younger, I guess I've always had a sensitivity to the concept of meaning and purpose in life. I've always wanted to find meaning, to find purpose in some way, even when I was young in high school, and death became something that I became very, very aware of and very thoughtful of, because when I was younger, I was, as a young artist, budding artist, visual artist, I wanted to know my purpose in life, and I thought that, as I looked at the world around me, all the various ways that people sought that, whether it's money, fame, sports, whatever. And of course, in high school, that's, you've got the various groups, jocks and, nerds and all that kind of stuff. Well, I really thought that, I guess in a way, fame would be the thing that would bring me meaning and significance in my life. And when I say that, I don't mean fame as in the modern sort of vain celebrity, famous for 15 minutes type of, Kardashian fame. You know what I mean? Like, really what I meant was, in order to find meaning and purpose, I thought that, well, if I created works of art that could express some kind of meaning, that would give me significance even beyond my death. So Michelangelo Buonarroti, who was the famous, Italian Renaissance artist, was my hero, and I loved his works. I studied them. He was my role model. I thought, if I could be like a Michelangelo, then maybe, one day, I'd be long dead and people would be studying my works, or they would be expressing some truth that I found in the universe, And so that was my thought. But I actually had an artist friend in high school who did commit suicide, and it really shook me up. Now, it never caused any thoughts in myself about suicide. I've never suffered with depression or anything like that, as a lot of artists do, actually. I've been one of the unusually well-adjusted artists, shall we say. But it did cause me to look upon even my own mortality and my own desires for fame, or maybe shall we say significance. And it made me really realize that, I conceptualized in my mind, what is the timeline of eternity? What's the timeline of the universe, right? If you look at the timeline of the universe, you stretch it out, and you've got these whatever billions of years, and then here's me, this little blip that doesn't exist but for a blip, and then time continues on without me. And I thought that really made me realize how insignificant my life was. It was kind of an existentialist sort of experience of the dread of the meaninglessness of my existence. And the death made me realize, look, when I was dead, it wouldn't matter if people were studying my work or whatever, because I didn't know where I would go. I didn't know but I assumed, that's, like most people, you just have this notion of, I guess I wasn't really a religious person. So I thought, well, I guess when I'm dead, I'm gone, and I thought, well, wherever I would be, I certainly wouldn't have any, whatever they were doing on earth with my artwork wouldn't really matter to me. I'd be completely cut off from it. And the other thing was I thought, I'd be dead a lot longer than I was alive. And that's putting it mildly, isn't it? Because in fact, that little blip of my existence is nothing compared to the timeline of eternity. And so that really made me have my existentialist sort of experience of the meaninglessness of all, and nothing that I could find significance in really would have that. It was a delusion to think that fame or people, treasuring me years beyond my death would have any real meaning, because really, as the book of Ecclesiastes says, in the end, all is forgotten, both the rich man and the poor alike, both the famous and the non-famous. Everyone is ultimately forgotten. It just takes famous people a little longer, but even then, they're just distant, whatever pictures in a history book, if you're lucky, right? That kind of thing. So it really doesn't matter. Really, the meaninglessness of life is real and true if you're in a godless world, in a godless universe, and that's where I was. And that realization really prompted me to start to think about, well, where do I go when I die? That kind of a thing. Now, I'd had a religious background in terms of Roman Catholic Church upbringing, but I didn't buy the religious thing. It didn't seem really too genuine to me at the time. But I did meet some real Christians who, basically they brought me to a church at the time. This is a long time ago, and it was really unique at the time, where it was a church that had youth group, and in the youth group they would go and play sports and games, and then they would have some drama, and they would play rock music, and it was all Christian oriented. Of course, that's kind of popular, or that's old hat now, but back in the day it was really new. And then they had some guy come up there and describe the gospel of Jesus Christ to the kids. And, for myself, it made sense. And I basically got to the point in my life, it made the Bible become relevant to my life. I began to see how it was relevant. I began to see how that vain alienation, that sense of alienation, that sense of lostness that I felt, that insignificance, was really an expression of a deeper problem. That is a spiritual disconnection from my Creator. In other words, that all the sins in our life, of course, coming from the Bible, you have, as a simple rule, the 10 Commandments, right? As I looked and I compared my life to the 10 Commandments, I realized, wow, my Creator sets up these standards, and I broke every one of them. Maybe not. Maybe I didn't murder someone, but I hated people in my heart. And Jesus said, if you hate someone in your heart, you've murdered them before God, right? In a spiritual sense. And so, whether it's lying and adultery, all that stuff, I either did it exteriorly or interiorly. And I basically just came to realize that sense of alienation was an expression of my disconnection from my Creator because of my sin, because of the badness of who I was as a human being. And that needed to be remedied. And that's for me to come back in a relationship with God. And so they explained the gospel of, Jesus died on the cross. What was that all about? Well, it's a religious sacrificial atonement for sin. And basically it just means, look, my sin separated me from God. And it's like, I'm in the I'm in the dock. I'm in a court of law, standing before my judge, you know, and I've been caught red-handed with capital crimes. You know, I mean, God says if you keep the whole law of morality, but you break just one, you're guilty of breaking the whole law, which means if you have an eternal, perfect, holy God, if you tell one little white lie, it's a stain of blackness that cannot come into God's presence. And I know a lot of people are offended by that. Oh, what kind of a loving God is that? But no, it's a holy God cannot accept that sin into his presence. And his love is manifest in that while he found me guilty before him for those sins, and therefore I would have judgment upon my soul, he sent his son to step in my place, go to the electric chair for me. I was deserving of the electric chair because of my sins, and Jesus took that electric chair for me. If I would have faith in him and put my faith in him, he would forgive me of my sins and take my place. That was a theological concept that I understood, and it made sense to me. I've never been a very, you know, I mean, I'm a passionate person, but I've never been an emotionally driven person. So it wasn't some big, you know, I was never a real bad person, like, you know, taking drugs and sleeping around or all this kind of stuff. I was your basic do-gooder. But I realized the sin in my heart and the sin of pride. C.S. Lewis often talked about how the sin of pride is the primal sin of all. And I had that in my soul, you know. And so my realization of that was, led me to that commitment in a very kind of a rational way, or kind of let's put it this way. My goal had been to seek truth. And it's since that point in time in my life that I can remember, it's always been, I want to know the truth wherever it leads, even if it's a scary thing, you know, even if I don't like where it leads, because I want to know what's true. I want to know what's true. And that passion for truth is what drove my art. I want to find the truth, and I want to communicate that truth to the world, to give to the world what I feel I found. Well, when I gave my life to Christ and I was forgiven of my sin, I became transformed from the inside out. I wasn't this big bad sinner who then my life was all changed. It was like, no, I realized this inner depravity. And over time, God's Holy Spirit changed me from the inside out. I began to see the world differently. I began to see how bad I really was. I didn't have the full understanding of that. And I began to be convicted of the sins and how I would treat people, and the words that I would say, and this kind of a thing. And so God's Spirit made my eyes begin to see these things, and he began to clean up my life. But it's an after the fact. It's not you become a good person, then God will love you and accept you. It's he forgave me in my sins while I deserved the electric chair. And then once he changed me by his Holy Spirit, then he enables me to be able to follow him. And that sort of depicted the transformation of my life. And as an artist, now that I found my eternal creator, I realized that was the longing that I've been driven by all my life, was to find my creator. I'd just been blinded by this depravity of my own. And once I made that reconnection with the eternal God, then I finally tapped into the meaning and purpose that I'd longed for all my life. And it was rich, it was deep, it was eternal. And it went beyond my little blip of a timeline, right? And it's not about me living forever, although that's the fact. That's the thing God gives you, the eternal life. But it's about coming back in a connection with the eternal God who sustains you forever. And that transformation was the thing that enabled me to find purpose and meaning in my art. That I never had before. And to this day, it still drives my passion. I want to communicate truth to the world. My goal is to still seek truth. And I've been wrong on a lot of things. I've changed my mind on a lot of things. So obviously, my faith doesn't make me perfect and doesn't make me theologically sound. Like I said, I've had to, repent and change my mind, as well as my behaviors. I haven't been the perfect, holy monk or anything either. So living with God is a continual process of refinement and transformation. And that's the excitement of life. That's it's the excitement of, the future of change and transformation that I have throughout my whole life. But it's that thing in which I'm not this, I don't see myself as I've found the one truth and I'm going to bestow it to the world. Like a lot of these you know, at least the myths and legends of some of these great artists, they certainly conceive of themselves with a lot of pride and seeing themselves as greater than other people or more special than other people. It's a common motif in a lot of artists. I don't see that myself that way. I see myself as quite um, a small brick in the big temple of God, in the big structure of God's holy temple. I'm just one little brick, but I'm doing my part because it's the eternal God that brings the meaning, purpose, and truth and all that. So I'm just a beggar who knows where there's bread, and I'm trying to point to where there's bread. And of course, in that process, I seek to glorify Him with my creativity. And that as a Christian, the next big difficulty in my life was learning how to, or shall we say, seeking to understand, how does this world of creativity and art, and of course at that time, by that time in college, I was I was just, I loved movies. Like, movies were just, they were so meaningful to me because they impacted me so deeply, and they could bring you to tears or strike your heart, with so much impact. But as a Christian, I noticed, even in back in my college days, I noticed, wow, I would go to these movies and I would see the negative impact of how they could really deceive people into thinking humanistic. They would have a humanistic worldview to them. If you can save yourself by your own goodness, or these kinds of things, as well as the sex and violence that was often so excessive. But that's another part of the journey where we'll get to eventually. But the notion that art has to art is about redemption, and but you have to accurately depict that from which you're being redeemed, which is sin, in order for your art to have powerful redemption. But at that point in my life, I was in love with movies, and I started to really get a desire. But I would see so many movies that just had a godless worldview in them, and they were pointing to a godless untruth. And my heart would burn, and like, God, I want your truth to be up on that screen. And how can that happen? And how can that be? And of course, this was what will date me, but Chariots of Fire. I don't know if any of you remember that movie. It's a classic now, but 1981, I think it was. But so when Chariots of Fire came out, that became the prime example to me. Hollywood can make movies that actually have a God-honoring message to them that can touch the spiritual souls of people. And that became my sort of my model, my role model. And I began to seek to try to learn how to write movies. And I'm self-educated, so I just started studying all the gurus on storytelling, and going to conferences and learning how to write, and writing a bunch of screenplays and stuff. So that was a process that took many years as well. But that was where I began to realize that, storytelling is a powerful, well, to me, it's the most powerful means of transforming culture and people's lives. Partly because I see what it does in culture. I see how it's moved culture, but also in my own life. To be quite frank, there are many movies that had more impact on my life than sermons. And I know there are a lot of other people who think that way. So that's kind of the driving force. Unfortunately, though, around that time, Christians were also seeking to try to, do things like make Christian movies and stuff, Christian music. And sadly, a lot of the Christian storytelling and movies were really poorly done. And even to this day, I have to say that sadly, the Christian movies, Christian TV type stuff is really, really poorly done. Now it's gotten better. And there's some really great, wonderful, movies and series out there that are done well now, and we've come a long way, and that's true. But there's still a long way to go, in my opinion. So I was always I was not really interested in that. I wanted to be in the world, but not of it. I wanted to tell my stories. Here's how I put it. I want to make Hollywood movies, but with a Christian worldview to them. That was how I was driven. And when I studied storytelling, I studied from those who were the professionals in Hollywood. I didn't study from Christians, but it was interesting as I began to study storytelling and how to tell a story. I found that the traditional classical Western story structure, so to speak, the mode of storytelling, was highly reflective of a Christian worldview, just structurally, right? So, for example, the storytelling is, or at least it's rooted, like if you study the hero's journey, right? Everyone knows that now. 30 years ago, not everyone knew that, but thanks to George Lucas, and then everyone found out he got his stuff from Joseph Campbell, But the hero's journey is the most common motif in Western storytelling, and it's the most powerful, effective means of communicating redemption. And it's basically, in as brief form as possible, it's following a hero, and the hero has a way of seeing the world, and that drives them. They have a passionate goal, something they want to accomplish, kind of like, remember how I wanted to be famous, right? And they're driven by that goal passionately, but there's a flaw in their inner character. This is sort of the typical storyline that you're going to see in most movies. There's a flaw inside their character that keeps them from really understanding the world correctly and be able to achieve that goal. And as they face obstacles trying to achieve that goal over and over again, they keep being driven to the point where near the end of the movie, it looks like they're never going to achieve that goal. And the villain's going to, the villain is the external oppressor who represents the internal oppression that the protagonist or the hero has, right? And as he's fighting the villain represents the opposing way of seeing the world or worldview. And so in a way, storytelling is about an existential means of showing a clash of worldviews. It's like making a rational argument against another worldview, but doing it dramatically, existentially, through human experience, so to speak. That's what storytelling does, and that's the power of it. And then as the hero faces his own flaw near the end of the movie, he's failed, he cannot achieve his goal, and as he faces his final, he's facing the bad guy, and usually someone dies near the end as a result of his own bad choices. The hero he learns what is his inner flaw, and by realizing that inner flaw and changing, he becomes redeemed, and he then finds the inner strength with which he can then overcome the exterior villain and achieve his goal. And that's the final act in a movie. You've heard 3-act structure, right? Beginning, middle, and end. It's kind of simple. Well, that reflects, I remember looking at in Acts, I think it's Acts 25, where Paul gives his testimony before, is it Festus? Anyway, one of the Romans there, and he gives his personal testimony, and he uses that same story structure of his own story. And so in a very real way, that story structure reflects the testimony of conversion that is actually in the Bible. And that was my personal revelation, that I began to realize that's how the power of storytelling works so effectively, because that's what it's doing. But here's the key to understand. That's not in that story structure does not necessarily work in the service of Christian faith, because of course you can have any worldview can have the same 3-act structure and can promote their own story of redemption, but they believe a different worldview, so their redemption is going to be different. So you can have secular humanistic worldview, you can have an atheistic worldview, or whatever, all these various ways of seeing the world that are non-Christian. So you can use that paradigm of conversion, obviously, for a different system of seeing the world. And so that's the difference there. And that's why, movies can be so powerful, affecting people, because they are means of conversion in a very real sense. Shall we put it this way, as we follow the protagonist and we cheer him on. Yeah, we want him to get the goal. We like him, but he's got some flaws in him and he has to learn and overcome those flaws. Well, as we're cheering him on, we are opening ourselves up to whatever the storytellers are going to tell us is the way that we become better people. As the protagonist finally makes his correct choices and overcomes his inner flaws, we're going to see that in ourselves as we're rooting for him, right? So it draws you in, and you vicariously experience the worldview of the storytellers by opening yourself up, by cheering on the protagonist, if that makes sense. So that's sort of the I don't know, maybe the heart and soul of my learning of storytelling and how it connected to my faith. And this took some years for me to work out. And as I worked out my aesthetic, which is my theory of beauty, in other words, how does God relate to my art, to beauty, to creativity? And when I say these things, art and creativity, it's not just artist types. Everybody has a sense of creativity. Creativity can be a generic term, right? You can be creative. A person may not be a painter or a filmmaker, but they can be creative in how they solve problems in their life, right? So creativity is using the imagination, and it's that the ability to use our imagination in order to solve problems or to understand truth or to seek truth. That's the heart and soul of um, of my own personal faith journey. Because at first I was like, okay, I'm a Christian and I have these religious things, Bible reading, prayer, fellowship, church, these kinds of things. But then I had my art, my normal life, my job, my day job or whatever. And they seem to be two different things, but um, learning my journey was to realize that it's like we have a view of sacred things in our lives and secular things in our lives. The sacred are the religious things, the secular are the normal real life things. But when you understand Christianity, you realize there is no secular sacred dichotomy. Do all things in the name of Christ. And as I sought to do that with my art, I was fighting this very real phenomenon of bad Christian art, and that I never wanted to be a part of. But so I basically got to the point, but at that point in my life, I was pursuing Hollywood screenwriting on the side, and I realized I needed to write a book about this because it's sort of like the act of writing things down really helps you solidify your own thoughts. And so I wrote my book, Hollywood Worldviews, Watching Films with Wisdom and Discernment. That came out in InterVarsity Press many years ago. And that was really helpful for me, but it also was something that I wanted to give to the church and to other religious people to help them appreciate the media they were watching more, the entertainment, because I saw two extremes in the world. I saw what I called cultural anorexics and cultural gluttons. And particularly in the church, you either had Christians who were typical sort of, oh, there's too much sex and violence in movies, so we don't watch TV, we don't watch movies, that's bad, you're a bad person, R-rated movies are all bad. And then you have the other side, it's like, no, I'm free in Christ, and they understand a little bit more about the nature of depiction of sin in stories is not always bad. Or they tell themselves, it's just entertainment, so don't take it so seriously. And by doing so, they are not understanding what's being done to them, and so they are being manipulated without realizing it. But on the other hand, the people who throw out the baby with the bathwater, they are misunderstanding the nature of imagination and how God communicates truth to us, where there's a lot of truth in a lot of these movies. They're not all perfect, and sometimes they have some bad ideas, but they're a mixture of good and bad. All of life is a mixture of good and bad. Even the sermons I hear are mixtures of good and bad. I mean, if I walked out of a sermon just because I didn't agree with everything, that wouldn't be very helpful, right? But people do that with movies, right? But when you begin to understand that you have to depict sin accurately in the beginning of the story, or maybe even to the end, but in the beginning of the story, because you have to show that from which we're being redeemed. And I wanted those Christians to maybe grow and learn to understand how to do that. Now, I don't think the problem is as widespread as it was when I first wrote the book. But I've noticed even to this day, my book, Hollywood Worldviews, is used in a lot of Christian colleges around the country because it does help them at least seek to understand how do they apply their Christian faith to their filmmaking, to storytelling, to et cetera. And so that was my sort of journey to where I got in my life, starting my Hollywood movie career. And that was right around the time when my first movie came out, which is To End All Wars. And we can talk about that, but that was sort of that was my faith journey, my integrated with my creative journey, but also how to understand my faith with the whole of my life, So, so that my next phase in my life was then filmmaking, Hollywood, and I began to, I was writing a lot of screenplays, and once I started getting movies made, To End All Wars was the first movie that got made, and stars Kiefer Sutherland, and it's basically a true story based on a book of memoirs of prisoners of war in World War II under the Imperial Japanese in prisoner of war camps, particularly in the Pacific Theater. So we're talking, around in Thailand at the time, Burma, Thailand. And so the Japanese were trying to build a railway for their supplies for the war. So they were using the prisoners of war to build those railways, and they were doing it as slave labor. It was brutal. And what drew me to the story was the heart and soul of it that I picked out of the memoirs was the story was that these prisoners of war, they're mostly Westerners, and they begin their journey as prisoners of war with a very Western individualistic mindset, survival of the fittest, each man to himself, right? But soon they're being demoralized to such an extent that they're starting to die because they're being starved and demoralized, and they have no hope. And so Ernest Gordon, the lead of the story, decided, you know what, we need to give these men hope. And so he thought, well, maybe if I start a jungle university, meaning, despite being prisoners of war, there'd be a few books throughout the camp that men were able to, get a hold of. Someone had a book of Shakespeare, someone had a book of Plato and Aristotle, and someone had a Bible. And so they started teaching this jungle university. And like I said, one of the texts was the Bible. And he started teaching the Bible, and it transformed the men's lives to the point where they began to understand how to love their neighbor so that they can work through it together. It gave them hope. And they began to triumph in that hope and learning to love each other as neighbors. But then ultimately, as the story ends up, they are challenged with what does it mean as the war comes to an end and the Japanese have been beating them brutally. What does it mean to love your enemy? And that is something that's so profound that to this day, I struggle with being able to know, could I have that kind of love myself? And that story was the perfect embodiment of everything I've been saying, in the sense of it's a great Hollywood movie. It's got everything in it, but it also it also is rooted in a strong Christian worldview, but it was, released in the secular market. And by the way, people can see it for free right now on Amazon Prime. So, if you haven't never seen it, check it out. It is a harsh movie. It's rated R, and there's a lot of suffering that the men have to experience, but it's based on reality and what they really experienced. And it shows how the gospel can apply to that aspect of life. And so in a very real sense, I made my Chariots of Fire, and I was, deeply satisfied. And it was a lifetime achievement of which I would never be able to equal after that. As is often the case with Hollywood, I've gone on to make some other movies.
I just have to say that it's an excellent movie, and it's a very emotional one. I saw this movie before I started following your work. I believe so. I don't know, was it a college project where we had to write a paper, or if it was something that I chose to see on my own. But that was a very emotionally, very brutally honest movie.
Yeah.
So I can only applaud you for God giving you the vision and the talent to make this movie, which I believe touched hearts of many people.
Yeah. To this day, I have people still telling me that's my favorite movie. It's just like, wow. And I've seen it recently again. It's just like, it really does weather time. It's one of those movies that will last for a long time. So yeah, I'm proud of that. But also then what happens is, as you get more involved in the industry, you have less and less control over things. We made that movie as an independent film, so we had a lot of control over it. But the less control you get, you're not as happy with some of the projects. But I've mostly been in the independent realm, not in the big studio movies. So there's still been more, at least some more, we've had some more control over the content, if you know what I mean. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey. And the latest movie I made was just this last year, which is, I've run the gamut. I mean, I've done movies about demon possession. I've done documentaries, not many movies, but my latest is actually a political satire called My Son Hunter. And of course, it's a political satire about Hunter Biden's laptop, which is not a very politically correct thing. So, needless to say, nobody in Hollywood would release the movie, so it's online at mysonhunter.com. But I wrote that movie, and my interest was not to make a political manifesto. What it was, the producers came to me and just said, hey, we want to make a movie about this Hunter Biden laptop because it's so fascinating. It really is a fascinating story, the context and everything. And, it's got everything in it: sex, drugs, rock and roll, prostitutes. And I just thought, yeah, it's very interesting and very bizarre, but is also very morally revelatory. And so I thought, well, but I want to do a documentary because, it's just lists of, documentaries are helpful. I don't have problems with documentaries, but for me personally, I want to see a narrative and see the information creatively communicated, which in my mind can have more power that way. You're allowed to make satire, do jokes and mock and all that kind of stuff. And so we did that movie, and they did a good job of it, and they had a big opening last year. A lot of views, and I think they put it up for free on Twitter for a short time as well. So if your audience is interested, mysonhunter.com, you can go watch it. But like I said, my interest wasn't so much. I'm not a political, like I have political views, but I don't want to do politics. I'm not a journalist. And so I found, as a matter of fact, I don't want to dwell on this too long, but one of the interesting things about the movie, so of course, because we're dealing with the truth, it's interesting. A lot of the revelations that are now coming out that they're talking about, they've been around. It's just the media ignored them, because I have them in the movie that I wrote 2 years ago. The same emails that they're now revealing of Biden's connections with Chinese and all that, it's been out there, right? So it's kind of satisfying that it's like, yeah, everything we put in our movie, people go, oh, that's made up or whatever. No, it was all real. But it was more than that. It was a deep tragedy of this sort of a family, kind of like not a mafia family, but something like that, where the patriarchal father figure, and they've got two sons, Bo and Hunter, and it actually was a very interesting dynamic between the sons and the father. And of course, Bo Biden had died years ago. So the relationship between Hunter and his father, Joe Biden, it's deep and full of a lot of dysfunction. Quite frankly, the kind of material that people love to make movies about. And I found it very interesting.
Sounds super biblical, like the
Yeah,
patriarchs had
yeah.
so many family issues.
Yeah, and this is kind of an epic. It's kind of got that. It's Shakespearean. I really saw it as Shakespearean, as a Shakespearean tragedy, which means, yeah, the movie has a viewpoint, but here's the thing: we wanted to tell a great story in the way that you tell great stories, and that is, the protagonist may have flaws, but you don't demonize them. So, we got attacked by all the, pro Joe Biden people, all the newspapers attacked us because it, they didn't like what was being showed. But some of them were really like, yeah, well, we have to admit, they kind of made Hunter sympathetic. And some of them were so ignorant that they thought they accidentally made Hunter sympathetic. In other words, so much of the media in this world are so full of ideology and propaganda. They don't understand good art. It's like, of course we made him sympathetic. That's what you do with stories. The purpose of telling stories are not to be propaganda where you demonize your opponents. That's what you see in Hollywood political movies, right? They're always demonizing their opponents in all their movies, whether it's, the Comey rule, demonizing Trump, or demonizing Sarah Palin in Game Change. It's always demonizing, and we didn't want to do that because we see Hunter as a sad, pathetic, but he's a human, and we found that twisted sort of family love is in some ways it's kind of universal, it's a bit of an extreme, of course, but, yeah. So it was like a Shakespearean tragedy, and that's what we wanted to write it. And so of course we made him sympathetic because we're not demonizing people. Right. So we're kind of proud. I'm proud of the fact that we did that with this movie and we were able to achieve it, even though, most Hollywood political movies, they're all just ideological stuff that's boring, quite frankly, because, it's just unreal. So that kind of brings me up to the present, at least with, movies and such. But at some point in that journey, years ago, well, we're talking about 13 years ago, I had a couple of difficult years. It's common in Hollywood. Everyone goes through it where you don't get jobs for a couple of years. And it forced me, to really reevaluate and reinvent myself, so to speak. And that's where I had written a screenplay about a Bible hero that I thought this would be a perfect combination for both Hollywood and Christians, because it would be an ancient story that was with a lot of fantastic sort of supernatural stuff that I think Hollywood would like. And at the same time, it's biblical hero, so Christians would like, so they could make a lot of money off of Christians and Christians would be happy. I just thought it was a great mix. And I was kind of right, because it was called Noah Primeval. It was a story about Noah. And unfortunately, I found out after I've been going around town with my script that Darren Aronofsky was trying to get his movie made. And I thought, okay, I'm a nobody. Excuse me. He's somebody. He's probably going to get made. So, and I suddenly realized, well, I've been having a couple difficult years. So why don't if I want to get my story out, why don't I write it as a novel? And then that's when I wrote Noah Primeval. It's my first novel. And there's a whole lot to that I'll put off for now. But I basically, as I studied and researched the Bible and the historical backgrounds and the mythological connections, I discovered a storyline, a thread, a theological thread in the Bible that was so imaginative and powerful. And I kind of didn't see it there before. And I don't mean this in terms of like a esoteric, like secret knowledge. No, I mean, it's there, but we don't see it because of our modern Western bias that we read the ancient text and we don't read it through the eyes of the ancient world. Find out what did the ancient culture, how did they see these things? What did they mean by it? We instead impose our own as we just read the Bible in English and we don't know the cultural background, right? And so as I did that, I discovered a thread that has led me to write sequels to that Noah Primeval that ended up being, I'm up to like, what is it now? It's about 16 novels or so. And let's see, 8, 9, 10, 11 plus 4, 15 novels. Chronicles of the Nephilim is the name of the first series. And then I have other series, Chronicles of the Watchers and Chronicles of the Apocalypse. And so these are all sort of connected to that same theological thread that was really fresh and unique to me, that made the Bible come alive in a way that I hadn't before. And that has become my latest, strongest storytelling in my life. They become wildly successful, and I'm grateful for that. I actually, when I first wrote Noah Primeval, I actually thought it would be controversial because I'm retelling a Bible story, and Christians, understandably, because I too hold the Holy Bible as being sacred, and so you don't want to play with God's word, right? But I believed I could tell a story and add some imagination in terms of the parts that the Bible leaves out, fill in with fiction in between the parts that we do know in the Bible, and also try to show the supernatural world that is hinted at in the Bible, but we don't see a lot of it. And I wanted to bring more of that out. So by necessity, you need some imagination. And I was afraid that Christians would go, no, this is tampering with God's word. And there are some who react that way, but by and large, they don't. They get it. They understand, oh, he's not writing scripture. He's retelling Bible stories, but trying to show I'm writing theological novels. I'm not rewriting scripture, that kind of a thing. And so I've been amazed at how successful they've been. And they've ended up becoming like the top 10 novels in, they've all been in the top 10 of biblical fiction on Amazon for the life of the series. And I'm grateful for that, but I didn't think it would sell at all. I thought it would be really negative. But I think one of the things that made it work was I did something that I was inspired by Michael Crichton, one of my favorite authors. What he would do is he would write an appendix at the end of his book where he talks about the real life scientific research that his fictional book was based on. And I did the same thing. At the end of each of my novels, I would put a appendix describing the historical and biblical research, because some of the stuff is so wild that they would think he made this up. But it's like, no, I didn't. And by doing that, it helped Christians. Some of them like the appendices as much as they like the novels. And I'm like that myself. So I get that. And I did that. I think that helped to explain some of that imagination that I was employing. So I've been grateful to see that it's been well accepted. So within all this, we have this theory and understanding of storytelling, and there's a lot to that. There's a lot to that we can focus on. But I don't know if that's a point in which you might want to bust in with a question. I don't know.
Yeah. Since your book, God Against Gods, which we'll be covering tonight, since it starts with the topic of myth, and since the first word in our channel is myths, I wanted to start this topic for tonight. When it comes to your book, you begin in your introduction talking about C.S. Lewis. So it's a little bit lengthy quote, but it's super important. So I just want to, read it. Maybe it will take
Please
30
do.
seconds or a minute. Okay, so you said that C.S. Lewis understood myth to be the truth embedded into the creation by the creator in such a way that even pagans would reflect some elements of that truth. Thus, when God himself incarnates truth into history in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, it is no surprise that it takes on mythopoeic dimensions reflected in previous pagan notions of dying and rising gods. He, meaning C.S. Lewis, concludes his essay with these memorable words. Now you're quoting C.S. Lewis. We must not be ashamed of the mythical radiance resting on our theology. We must not be nervous about quote unquote parallels and pagan Christs. They ought to be there. If it would be a stumbling block if they weren't. We must not, in false spirituality, withhold our imaginative welcome. If God chooses to be mythopoeic, and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopathic? For this is the marriage of heaven and earth, perfect myth and perfect fact, claiming not only our love and our obedience, but also our wonder and delight, addressed to the savage, the child, and the poet, in each one of us, no less than to the moralist, the scholar, and the philosopher. When I read this, I was like, wow, I don't know how to exclude any word from this lengthy quote, because everything seems so important. I'm thankful because you're not the only researcher, scholar, author, theologian who writes and actually challenges us as believers to stop thinking about myth. When we use word myth, many times we equate it to something of a legend, like legendary, like it's a fairy tale. No, rather myth is something true. It's something real. It has so many elements of the truth, but it also combines this epic fight of good of evil on the cosmic scale, where people are involved and all these things. And then you quote C.S. Lewis, and you actually encourage us, unlike so many people who are agnostics or atheists, and some of them are former Christians, unfortunately, who when they want to use one of the arguments, they will always say, oh, compare Christ with all these, pagan, prophets or gurus who came before him, see so many similarities. So they would try to attack us. And if we're not ready, we'll be like, wow, this may be true. So while my faith is actually going down, I'm being challenged. I don't know how to respond. Thus, my faith is being, it can diminish in a way. But you're actually, helping us understand that there's nothing to be afraid of myths. So
Yeah.
What is your thinking when it comes to myth?
Yeah, it's funny. Whenever I have some kind of a theological growth or understanding, um, or revelation, so it's not, not from God, but I'm just saying illumination or whatever. I often discover that C.S. Lewis already had that, and he wrote about it better than I could ever express it myself. And that was true with this book as well. Even my own journey of learning the limits of reason. I'd always been driven to love apologetics, but C.S. Lewis, driven by the same obsession with rationality and apologetics, but it brought him to the end where he had his own an experience of seeing that the reason can only take you so far. It can't reveal all the truth. And that's, of course, where myth and other imagination can go beyond that. And that revelation, of course, the way he wrote about it was fantastic. And I'm like, that's exactly what I went through. So yeah. And unfortunately, we still have a difficulty, if whenever I use the word myth, I still get Christians that just react against that because they do mean synonymously with false. It's false. It's false. So, and in some contexts, that sadly, that's what we mean. Oh, that's a myth. That's not true. But we really do have to understand it much deeper. And I don't know if we'll ever be able to, unless without maybe creating a new word or something, because it's got such baggage connected to it, But mythology, the mythology of a culture, mythological stories, they're not false. They are about truth. Now they use fiction sometimes, or they, maybe they tell legends or stories that may not have really happened, and maybe they do believe they did, but that's not the point of them. The point of them is that mythologies communicate the worldview and the values of a culture. They embody them. So every culture has a mythology or mythologies. Obviously, there's, culture isn't completely homogenous, but, various cultures do have a mythology. There is a Christian mythology. For example, the mythology or the worldview and values of Christianity is creation, fall, redemption, consummation. Those four things, which, by the way, are also the four steps of a worldview, meaning you have some kind of a belief. This is not inherently Christian. Well, it is, but it isn't, meaning the Christian worldview is God created the universe to be a certain way, creation, fall, but mankind fell into sin and brought trouble upon it all, right? Creation, fall, redemption. So then God provided a way to redeem man's sin, the cross and Jesus Christ, to bring him back to the original creation, so to speak, bringing us back to the garden, at least spiritually, right? And then ultimately there's a future view when the consummation, which is what will the world be like when God, or when his worldview is completely envelops all of culture and it makes it the best it can be, or in the Christian worldview, when Christ returns and makes everything new, makes a new heavens and earth, that kind of a thing. Well, all worldviews, that's and you think about it, that's a story, isn't it? Creation, fall, redemption, consummation. It's a timeline story. Story is about events that occur in a timeline, because that's how we experience life or time, is through chronology. Now, stories can tell things out of chronology, but basically story is, this embodiment of creation, fall, redemption. And as I said earlier, you can have secular redemption that has a creation, fall. The secular humanistic worldview believes creation. It believes creation is actually evolution. Everything's chance, and there is no God. That's the creation view, meaning the origin view. Then the fall is man becomes religious in order to have power over other people and control them. That's the fall. So redemption is overcoming religion, becoming atheist and getting rid of religion because religion is bad. And then ultimately in the future, it's usually some Marxist utopia, all of mankind is one in this harmony without God, that kind of a thing. So as you can see, all worldviews follow that same creation, fall, redemption motif. And so that's the mythology of the culture, right? And that's the Christian mythology also includes, by the way, and this touches upon God, what's it called? God Against the Gods. That book I wrote because I wanted to explain how God himself actually redeems pagan imagination. What I mean is he actually uses things that are in the pagan mindset and he redeems them by twisting them and undermining them and giving them new definitions within his own realm. Now, some of it God himself creates and the pagans twist and distort. So God's just bringing it back. But I'll give you an example of something that's the reverse. But part of the Christian mythology is the need for atonement. What is atonement? I'll put it in simple terms. It's like I said in my personal testimony, it's restoring communion with God through blood sacrifice. So blood atonement, substitutionary sacrifice, these are concepts that all religions have had to one degree or another, long before Christianity, long before Judaism. Men believed in sacrifice to the gods, right? So is the Bible ripping off these pagan religions? Well, no, and I'll explain why. But this is the mythology this is part of the mythology of the beliefs and values of what truth is, and they exist beyond our world, and they give meaning and significance to this world. That's what mythology is all about. And so, people say, well, blood sacrifices long before Judaism even came into the world. Yeah, that's true. But if you understand what the Bible is saying, God, the creator, created the universe and it reflects his glory and his mythology. And so within the very nature of creation itself is this notion of sacrifice. So it makes perfect sense. Like you read about the story of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel bringing sacrifices to God. These were the first human beings, right? Cain and Abel bringing their sacrifices to God. One was not acceptable, so Cain killed Abel, right? And that brings all this bloodshed. But that's, there's that storyline shows that God puts the notion of sacrifice within the very created order itself. So of course, pagans they're created in the image of God. Everyone is, but they distort God's truth. So there's a sense in which all religions are going to have this notion of sacrifice embedded within their very souls, but they're going to twist it and create a pagan version of it. Sacrifice to the gods, appeasing the gods, this kind of a thing. Just so the fact that Judaism comes along chronologically later doesn't mean that it takes its ideas from paganism. It just means that God creates within the universal, within the very structure of the cosmos, we have this mythological concept of sacrifice and atonement. And it's just a matter of who gets it right. And of course, if someone, as the book of Romans tells us, God creates humanity, but sinful humanity turns from God, worships the creation instead of the creator, and twists everything around. The pagans, godless people know their creator, but they intentionally, this is what Romans says, but they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And that's a very important concept to understand, which means they're created in God's image, they reflect his glory, but their sin makes them repress the truth and create their own religion that places themselves at the center in some way or another and create other gods, false idols, because they don't want to follow their creator. They don't want to be beholden to their true creator. They want to make their own religions and use those religions as control. So that's an example of mythology, whether you like it or not. You may say, no, that's theology. Well, say what you will, it's still mythology. That's why mythology should not have a negative term. It should be a term that describes the worldview or values of a culture or of a people. And so we should embrace it in that sense. So another example of this that this now leads into that book, God Against the Gods, which is available in paperback, Kindle, and audiobook exclusively at Amazon. Got to get my plug in there. So all my books are on Amazon. You can find them all there. But God Against the Gods was my attempt to try to explain a little bit of what I just said and to show how this isn't just me making this stuff up, trying to justify it. It's actually in the Bible. God himself does it in the Bible. And one of my favorite examples is Leviathan. So I write a lot about Leviathan because now there are Christians who believe Leviathan is just a dinosaur. No, it's not. If you study Leviathan in its ancient context and throughout the whole Bible, and you see how all the cultures around them also had a Leviathan in them, which is a sea dragon of chaos. And you read this when you read the passages in the Bible, you see very clearly that the writers are using Leviathan as a metaphor or as a symbol. That's the best way to use it, as a symbol of chaos. Why? Because in that ancient world of Hebrews, they understood the sea. The sea was mysterious, right? They couldn't plumb the sea depths like we can. And even we can, but it's still mysterious. It's beyond us, right? The depths of the sea. So that sea for them was also wild and untamable, and it represented chaos. So they would use the sea as chaos, and the sea dragon of chaos became that ultimate symbol that fight the chaos that fights against us in our real world. So much so that all the religions, including Israel's religion, would describe stories of their storm god conquering the sea dragon, or conquering the rivers and the seas, but also conquering the sea dragon. As a matter of fact, the Canaanite religion called their sea dragon Leviathan. So, and Leviathan had multiple heads. If you read in Psalm 73, it talks about God crushing the heads of Leviathan. That's plural. Heads, plural, of a singular Leviathan, which means it had multiple heads. So it was a common notion of this symbol that represented chaos. And in Psalm 73 and other places in the Bible where it talks about Leviathan, like Psalm 73 particularly is talking about, in fact, maybe I can even go there because since we have the time, it's kind of one of my favorite Psalms and one of my favorite images, So he's talking about, I'm sorry, not Psalm 73. I've been wrong this whole time. Terrible. Psalm 74. Scratch all that. Psalm 74. Psalm 74. So he's talking about the covenant nature of God. And he goes in verse 12, yet God, my King, is from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. And he says this, he's talking to God. You divided the sea by your might. That's a reference to the Red Sea, because we'll see in a minute. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads, plural, of Leviathan. So it's not just heads on multiple monsters, it's multiple heads on one monster too. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open the brooks, dried the streams. Yours is the day, yours is the night. You established the heavenly lights and the sun. You fixed the boundaries of the earth. You made summer and winter. There is, let's see here if I can get this down here. There's another Psalm. I think it's Isaiah 51. So this Psalm that I was reading, dividing the sea by your might, scholars will tell you that's an oblique reference to the parting of the Red Sea. So he's saying when you part the Red Sea, you broke the heads of the sea monsters. Well, what does that mean? And you gave them as food to the creatures of the wilderness. What does that mean? The motif of eating the body of Leviathan was a common concept of their God, destroys the chaos or pushes back the chaos to create his own covenanted order. And what is the Red Sea Exodus? What did it lead to? Sinai. What is that? The covenant. God establishes his covenant order by pushing back the chaos of the Egyptian world that they had come from, right? And the chaos, and creating his covenant order on Sinai. And this is further confirmed in Isaiah 51, where it's using the same kind of language to describe, it's actually kind of describing it's using creation language to describe creation of the covenant. So he says in Isaiah 51:15, I am the Lord your God who stirs up the sea so its waves roar. I have put my words in your mouth. He's talking to Moses here. I put my words in your mouth and covered you in the shadow of my hand, establishing the heavens and laying the foundations of the earth. saying to Zion, you are my people. So what was that? He's using creation language to describe creating heavens and the earth. He's talking to Moses, and he's talking about the Red Sea, parting of the Red Sea, as a way of creating the heavens and the earth. Well, creation of the heavens and the earth is a symbol of covenant. It's the way he describes his covenant. It's the way they look at the cosmos. And so God establishes the foundations of the earth when he establishes his covenant with Moses at Sinai. And lo and behold, just a few verses before, in verse 9, we read about him piercing the dragon, drying up the sea, the waters of the great deep. That's the Red Sea thing, right? You cut Rahab in pieces. Rahab is another word used synonymously with Leviathan, the sea dragon. So this is just one example of what I'm doing in that book, God Against the Gods, where this is a pagan symbol that was used long before the Bible was written. There's a sea dragon of chaos in Egypt, sea dragon of chaos in Canaan, in Babylon. There was Marduk fighting Tiamat, the sea dragon. He creates the heavens and earth by splitting the sea dragon in half. So it's a common motif amongst all religions. They use it symbolically to describe their God establishing his covenanted order by pushing back the chaos of the world around them. And in a way, that's, the wilderness of Israel, of Israel in the wilderness. That was their chaos as well. But then on Mount Sinai, God establishes his covenanted order. So that's one example of many examples in the Bible where I show that that's a common pagan image, that it's a symbol that can be used for any purposes, right? And it's like he's saying, you think your God, crushed the sea dragon and created the universe, but no, our God Yahweh is the one who crushed the sea dragon, created his covenanted order with Israel. And so it's just a means of doing that, right? And so that's one example of how God redeems pagan imagination. Let me put it this way. How else would God communicate, as the notion of inspiration says, that God uses the people within their own time periods and their own thought processes to communicate his truths? They can't understand the modern people think. They're not going to write for the modern. They're going to write the way they see it. And the common cognitive environment, the common motifs, symbols, images that everybody used in those days to describe their own beliefs, the Hebrews were part of that too. And they used it to describe their beliefs. Just like today, we as Christians, we use other genres to tell our stories. Like, I just wrote a novel about a serial killer called Cruel Logic. It's coming out September 12th, which is really short. It's coming shortly. And it's a serial killer story, and it's a fictional story, but kind of like Silence of the Lambs, right? So that's a genre of storytelling. And I'm a Christian and I'm writing serial killers. Well, the notion of the serial killer in my story is I'm using the serial killer genre to communicate that let me say this. The notion of the story is this. There is a killer going around a fictional college campus in California. And he happens to be a philosophy professor who's a serial killer. What he does is he captures university professors and he debates them. And the topic of the debate is his moral right to kill them. So he says, okay, give me one reason. If what you say is true about the universe, give me one valid reason why I should not kill you, and I'll let you go. What he's doing is he's trying to uncover what their moral system is. And in fact, if you have atheistic, godless worldviews, you ultimately have no foundation for morality. It ultimately reduces to power or to individual subjective feelings, which that's no way to adjudicate what's true or false. It's just personal and subjective, and it's relative. So you either have relativity or power. There is no foundation for morality. And he's making that sort of moral argument, and these professors can't answer him, And of course, he has something more in his plans as he's trying to make a point to the cop and the psychologist who are tracking him down. But I explain that just to make the point that The story is a genre about serial killers, but I'm using it as a means to communicate the moral argument for the existence of God, basically. And so, what else do we do as Christians in our environment, as God's people in our environment? We use the genres and motifs. I'll write a vampire story and I'll use it to describe, be an analogy for the sinful nature, something like that. So it's natural for God's people to use the genre and symbols and images that they're all familiar with, because that's how people think. So I use those images and I incarnate them in stories in order to communicate that worldview. Now, of course, the better you do it, the more entertaining it is, and the worse you do it, the more preachy it can be. So that's always the problem, and that's why people get turned off by some stories, right? Because they're too preachy or whatever. But that's what I'm saying, is that why wouldn't the writers who wrote the Bible, they're no different than us. They live in a culture that uses all these concepts and images that they understand. Of course, they're going to use that to communicate the truth of God. And that's sort of the premise of God Against the Gods. And I go through other examples that we can talk about as you want.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to read another quote. It's from your second page. It's regarding today's scholars. You said that because of a modernist bias of anti-supernaturalism, some scholars define myth as a necessary and universal form of expression within the early stages of man's intellectual development, in which unexplainable events were attributed to the direct intervention of the gods. So basically, for the contemporary agnostic or atheist person, this was the mindset of a primitive person, a caveman who still didn't develop. He was still in these early evolutionary stages, or even maybe late, but still nothing compared to a modern man. And this also reminds me of the almost God of the gaps, like that atheists many times want to accuse Christians of believing, oh, just because there's a storm or just because there's a volcano or earthquake, you want to believe in God. And if no one asked me this, but my answer would be something like, well, no, I believe in God regardless of these things. But just because I have scientific explanation how earthquakes or thunder happen to be, that doesn't mean that they just happen in a naturalistic environment, which were uncaused by any, I won't say force, but I would say without a mind that is behind them. Rather, I see a supreme mind who set these things in motion, and they exist because of someone who triggered them. So I like how you quote them in all these supposedly the cream of society today, the scientists and the secular people who mock Christians, and put them in the same category of the pagan myths as this doesn't make sense. It's just like something that we should have we should have evolved long ago and stop believing in gods. So I just want to say that I appreciate that part. And when it comes to this topic of myths, they can be real, like biblical myth being a true myth, and Christianity, as C.S. Lewis and Paul can say, Christ being
Exactly.
the truth myth. But also when it comes to false myths, they encompass a lot of gods. And to the surprise of many Christians, Old Testament actually speaks of the existence of these gods. And I know that not everyone is willing to listen or talk about these things. They may suddenly think that we are being non-Christian, or maybe even to a form of where someone is willingly or not distorting the word of God and talking heresies, but not actually. Old Testament, but also New Testament, speak a lot about the existence of these entities who are also called Elohim, just as much as God is. Yahweh is called Elohim. So
Yeah.
there are these ontological entities and spiritual beings. They do exist, and you have covered a lot in your first chapter, Deuteronomy 32, which late Dr. Michael Heiser is also using a lot in his teaching and books. So how about us? You start by comparing Deuteronomy 32:39 with 32:43. I have no problem reading them. So 32:39 says, See now that I, even I, am He, and there is no God beside me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand. Now, verse 43, so 4 verses later, God says, "Rejoice with him, O heavens, bow down to him, all gods, for he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's land." So, Brian, can you please help us understand how come there's no God, there's only one God, but then bow down to him, all the gods? Is there a paradox, or is there maybe something that we don't hear in the global church when it comes to the teaching of this Elohim so-called
Yeah.
God?
Yeah. Yeah. This is a problem that we've had in evangelical Christianity, I think. And that is that this notion that you're bringing up about gods and Elohim, it is a more nuanced, let us say, it is a far more nuanced theological concept than what most Christians have been taught to understand. And so they have a kind of a prejudice that makes them react violently when you start to talk about the way the Bible really what the Bible really says. And that is, I think what you gave there is a great synopsis of how, well, the Bible says both, that God is one, and yet there's one God, and yet there are other gods. I would like to quote also Psalm 82. Psalm 82:1 says, God, Elohim, has taken his place in the divine council. So there's a divine council, council of divinity. What's that? In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And that word gods is literally gods. It's the same word Elohim that's used of Yahweh. So whenever you see a Bible verse or verses that appear to say the opposite using the same word, that's not the Bible contradicting itself. What that means is there's more nuance to this concept than just a flat reading. It's ignorant and uneducated to just read the Bible flatly. This is the danger of people say, well, I just read the Bible plainly. You're not reading it plainly. If you're reading it out of its original ancient context, you're just reading the words, and however you understand them, you're actually imposing your own context upon an ancient world that's alien. You're actually engaging in misinterpretation of the Bible, which is why we need to be so careful. And the way to understand this is Elohim has taken his place in the divine council amidst the Elohim. He holds judgment. Well, Michael Heiser he's been an evangelical scholar who, he's a Bible believing scholar. He's passed away this last year, sadly. But he's the one who's helped to explain that the notion of God in the Bible, the modern day notion of gods, is not biblical. When we say the word God, we automatically think, well, Yahweh, basically, what we would understand as Yahweh, who's the omniscient, omnipotent creator of all things. So therefore, there can be no other gods, right? But the problem is the Bible doesn't use the word gods that way. The Bible uses the word God of Yahweh, he's God, but it also uses it of divine angels, for lack of a better word, divine beings around God's throne, the divine council. There are these gods, and they're also called sons of God. So there's multiple terms for them, but they are called gods in multiple places. And then sometimes a human, like a spirit, a human spirit, like remember the story of Saul calling up the spirit of Samuel. And it says that Samuel was an Elohim, which is God. So it's not saying Samuel's a God, like Samuel's God. It's just saying the best way to understand it, Heiser has helped to explain that Elohim is more like a word of, what's the word? It's more of a residential location than it is ontological being, or shall we say, it focuses on this particular spiritual dimension. So beings of the spiritual dimension are Elohim. That's the Elohim dimension. So you have dead human spirits are called Elohim, angels are called Elohim, God's called Elohim. Those are all beings in the spiritual dimension. Now, the Bible also says, though, that so it says that Yahweh is Elohim, but no Elohim is Yahweh. So that's where you get the notion of God. Yahweh is the God of gods. He's the Elohim of Elohim. There's no one like him. And that's the notion that's called the incomparability of Yahweh. And there you have many, many scriptures that talk about the God being incomparable. So a lot of times when these passages are saying, I am God and there is no other, I wonder if I have that passage here. I don't have it in front of me, but when it's saying I am God and there is no other, you think, well, that's just saying there's no other gods. Well, no, actually that's not the case, because elsewhere in the Bible, two other places, there's a poetic passage that talks about Babylon as if it were an entity, referring to the king of Babylon, but he's saying, I am Babylon and there is what is it? I am the city and there is no other. And so what you find is that phraseology is basically saying there's no one like me. There are other cities, but there's no city like Babylon, right? So to say I am God, there is no other, it's saying, yeah, there are other Elohim, but no one is at all like the creator God. So the other Elohim are actually created by Yahweh. Yahweh's not created. He's eternal. No other Elohim is eternal, omniscient, omnipresent, all creating. No other Elohim is like that. It just means that they're in that spiritual realm. Now that makes it difficult in our discussion, because we're traditionally, we've been programmed to think that to use that word gods plural is to say you're pantheistic, right? There's many gods, and it's like, well, no, that's not what it means, but the Bible does say it. So the Bible says there are gods, so you have to understand that nuance. So therefore, the passage you said in where was it, Deuteronomy again? I think that's the same way to understand it. Okay, it's not being contradictory. What it's saying is, in one sense, God is the God of all gods, and in another sense, no one is like him. There is no one else but him. He is, for us, Paul says, for us, there is one God. That doesn't mean there aren't other gods that people worship, and they might even have demonic reality to them, right? I mean, Deuteronomy 32:17 says, it says the Israelites, when they sacrificed to the pagan gods of Canaan, it says they sacrificed to demons that were not God, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently. So he's saying that there's a demonic spiritual reality behind the gods that they were sacrificing to. What does that mean? What does that look like? I'm not entirely sure, but it tells me that that these pagan gods are demons. They're not God. They're not our God, Yahweh, but they are demonic, right? And yet the Bible still calls them gods. So we need to, I guess it's a difficult, I admit it's a difficult thing, because we've all been programmed to think one way. And we have to, my rule has always been, this is why I'm willing to talk about this and try to make this argument. Because ever since I became a Christian, it had always been one of my principles has always been sola scriptura, meaning scripture is my ultimate final authority for knowing truth about God and knowing him. So therefore, if the Bible says something, if I don't like it, it doesn't matter. I have to accept it. I have to change my theology to match the Bible. When I read something in the Bible, I don't change the Bible to say something that matches my theology. That's twisting the Bible. So I don't, what I've learned is, well, we've come to define God unbiblically, and we need to change that, because the way the Bible uses God and gods is very different from our way. And that doesn't mean, that because we've been programmed to think one way, we automatically think, well, that's paganism, that's Mormonism, that's no. It's not what those are different. Those are pantheistic. Polytheistic. I use the word pantheism. I meant polytheism. They do believe there are literal other gods like God, right? But that's not the way the Bible talks. So we have to speak the way the Bible speaks, or we are the ones twisting the Bible, right? So I admit this is difficult, because of our bias is so blinding. It's a very difficult thing to help Christians to see and understand, but I'm willing to do it, because if the Bible says it, that settles it. What's the saying?
Brian,
if the Bible says it, I believe it, and that settles it.
Yeah. Do you think it will be fair when it comes to this verse 17, which in the original Hebrew, it's using the word shedim? Would it be fair that these demonic entities are closer to what Paul describes as, thrones, powers, principalities, rather than what Jesus was rebuking from people. Would you agree that these entities mentioned in Deuteronomy 32, especially verse 17, that these are way more powerful principalities, way more powerful so-called demons, maybe something like in Daniel 10, rather there will be like a whole regional of beings, demonic overlords, rather than just demonic soldiers, so
Demons.
to call them.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, who would possess a person. So we are talking about small e Elohim, who regardless if they're called demons or gods, but they're way more powerful than like we
Yes.
see in movies, or we hear stories of some people being demonized. Is that fair?
Yeah. So now what you're getting to is another controversial thing that is in the same passage, Deuteronomy 32, a little bit earlier, verse 8. And this is another thing that all the ancient religions believe this in one form or another, and so did the ancient Jews. We miss it because we don't have that mindset. We have a modern mindset. We read over, we don't understand the Hebrew and such. But if you study this closely, you'll see this is the case. Anyway, the ancient world believed that, including Jews, the Hebrews, that that the heaven and earth were linked, spiritual world and the earthly world were linked, and that in particular over earthly authorities there were spiritual authorities, and they were linked in some way. So it could be over a nation, or it could be over a city, or even over a king, but basically the authorities on earth had authorities over them. Therefore that's why you get language of like when there's a war on earth, there's a war in heaven. Thus we get Daniel 10, right? So you've got these principalities of Persia and Greece. They're battling at the same time that the earthly nations of Persia and Greece are battling. So isn't that interesting? There's a link between those two. Well, here's where this all comes from. And there's a lot more about this. We could talk for 2 hours just on this, but a lot of Bible passages, this is why if you want to, I don't know how much I talked about this in that book, God Against the Gods, but there is another book called When Giants Were Upon the Earth that I've written that goes into this in detail for sure. But the short version of it is Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Most High, that's Yahweh or Elyon, he's described with many different names, but the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance. What is that? When did he do that? When he divided mankind. Scholars will tell you the divisions of mankind, that's a reference to Babel. What did he do? He divided the nations, he divided the languages, and that's when the nations of the 70 Gentile nations of Genesis 10, that's what it's referring to, because you have the Tower of Babel, and that's where those original nations that spoke different languages came from in the biblical story, right? So it's saying when God gave to the nations their inheritance and when he divided mankind, when you hear the word inheritance, understand that that's almost always a reference to land, inheriting land, but it's also a reversal thing. Like, gods can inherit you or you can inherit gods. I'll show you in a second. When God did that at the Tower of Babel, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. What does that mean? Well, this isn't the only place that this talks about it, but essentially this describes that notion that at the Tower of Babel, God's saying, look, mankind's going to keep worshiping false gods and idols, so I'm going to give them over. All right. He said, if you're going to keep doing this, build the Tower of Babel, that's it. I'm going to give you over. You're going to worship these gods. I'm going to place you under their authority. The number of the sons of God that they're being given to, the sons of God is a whole nother theological thread, but suffice it to say, you look up, that's a technical term throughout the Bible that is referring to divine beings from God's heavenly throne, or gods, but they're called sons of God. And these are fallen ones that are placed in authority over the Gentile nations. The word nations used in the Old Testament is a referral to the Gentile peoples, because Israel saw themselves as the elect of God, chosen of God, and all the others were Gentile nations, and they were bad. So he's saying these nations are placed under the authority of these sons of God, and fix the borders of the peoples. What's that? That's the national borders. So in the same way that Genesis describes those nations created, this is the belief that there were spiritual authorities over nations and over authorities. But then he says this, but the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. So the peoples inherit lands, but also God's with them. They are their allotment. This is another theological concept, allotment. The Gentile nations are allotted to these sons of God. So God allots Israel to himself. So in a very similar sense, he's saying, in the same way that their Gentile nations are under these authority of these other false gods, because they won't worship me, I will be the God over Israel, and I will give them a territorial land of Canaan, which will be the promised land of Israel, right? So this is where he's describing that concept that like I said, it plays itself out throughout the scripture text. And, Daniel 10 is a perfect example of that. What I just said, you've got the when there's a war in heaven, there's a war, or when there's a war on earth, there's a war in heaven between those principalities and powers. And what you were indicating, this is why by the time of Paul, he's no longer using the concept sons of God. And there's a very particular reason for that, which we can explain, but he's using the language of principalities and powers to express those spiritual powers over authorities of earth. And the reason why he's doing that, he's saying, what does he say? We wrestle not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers. Those are the ones we're battling with. And what's the point? The point is, when Jesus, if you go back to Psalm 82, you see a description of that divine council, and you see a description of those gods who are over the nations, and God is judging them. You know that phrase, it's in Psalm 82:6. I said you are gods, sons of the Most High, sons of God. There they are. All of you, nevertheless you shall die like men. What does that mean? Well, he's talking to the sons of God who are gods, and they're spiritual beings. And he's saying, even though you are spiritual beings, I'm going to judge you, and you're going to die just like other princes, because you have judged, you have ruled unjustly over those nations. Then the last verse of Psalm 82 says, arise, O God, judge the land, for you shall inherit the nations. This is a messianic verse. Arise, that word in Greek is aneste, which I think is a theological reference to the resurrection. As Paul often says, when Jesus Christ, his resurrection, it's a complex of events. The resurrection, death, resurrection, and ascension is all about Christ's kingship, right? So arise, O God, and judge the earth. That's going to be Jesus. He's going to judge the earth. But when does that happen? At the resurrection. For you shall inherit all the nations. So here's what Paul is getting to about these principalities and powers, is that when the gospel of the kingdom of God is finally initiated and consummated in the world, right? Christ dies, resurrects from the dead, and he judges Israel as he did in that first century. Then the gospel goes to all the nations, and men and women from every tribe and every tongue and every nation can now come into the kingdom of God. Well, before they couldn't, right? Because they were all under the authority of these sons of God, right? And people could become Jews, but almost nobody did. Why? Because they were in bondage to these gods, these other demonic beings, right? So what he's saying there is Christ, through his resurrection and ascension, he gets declared as king. Now he is the sole authority, and he disinherits those gods. So at the death and resurrection and ascension of Christ to kingship, he disinherits, or the gods are disinherited from their allotment. They no longer have the nations under their authority. They are judged. And Messiah now rules as king, and now he owns all the nations. He inherited all the nations. Jesus is king over all the earth, right? He's king over all the nations. The gospel is the expression of God's triumph over the principalities and powers that he does in Christ, and that is publicly and historically consummated in the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Why? Because the temple was the Old Testament incarnation, or it was the incarnation of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. But if the Old Covenant's gone, then you got to get rid of the Old Covenant institution, right? So that destruction marks that final consummation of the new kingdom of God, that with a new covenant that has come into the earth, and Jesus inherits all the nations. And now that's why we now have people from every tribe and tongue and nation. They're no longer bound under the authority of those gods. They've been judged, right? And that's why it's a powerful theological thread, but it is rooted in a concept that all the ancient religions, listen, I mean, Plato writes about it. Plato writes about the belief that there were gods who were in authority over the nations. So there's Canaanites believed that. Babylon believed it. Egypt believed it. So they all had this notion, this understanding of spiritual authorities. They all have different versions of it, of course, but yeah, so that's another way that God's communicating how he works with us, and how the spiritual world is to be understood. And yeah, it's a beautiful theological thread that I think opens up the Bible in an exciting, imaginative way.
Brian, thank you for this combo of biblical and systematic theology, which was very important, I believe, for those who are more mature Christians, as well as those who are just stepping into the faith and learning to walk with God. Some of these things, I understand, can be very challenging. Some of these things can seem unorthodox, as if when I first heard about Dr. Michael Heiser and all this teaching, I was very guarded years and years ago, before I even went to Moody College.
Me too.
Because I always cared about apologetics. I always cared about, protecting the faith, teaching what is sound doctrine and stuff like that. And then as I opened myself little by little, I met people online who started explaining these things to me. I saw that Dr. Heiser is being endorsed by some solid, well-known Christian theologians, especially when it comes to our Protestant branch. I started opening myself to all of these things, and more I started realizing how much we're missing out by not realizing this very important theme in the Bible. If we take out all the supernatural aspects when it comes to gods, demons, territorial spirits, from Proto-Evangelion until the end, a lot of the context is missing from the ancient Near East context. And I'm so grateful whenever we can dissect these complex things. And I want to encourage viewers, whoever you are, just because some words may be complex, just because some terminology may need time to be understood, just be encouraged to continue digging and studying, because it's very rewarding. And because I just mentioned biblical and systematic theology, part of theology is apologetics. You have dedicated your second chapter to apologetics, specifically of God using, or at least biblical authors using polemics in the Old Testament as the way they would present certain themes which were well known among the ancient Jewish neighbors. And one of these things were when it comes to the chaos camp, that there was chaos in the Bible. I have the whole episode with one person where we talked about chaos as being God's enemy, or where we talked about Leviathan, or about Baal. How about us starting with Baal? And when it comes to the polemics and apologetics, how come Old Testament authors in the Pentateuch, they're using, but also later in the Psalms, how come they're using same terminology for Yahweh as for Baal? For example, the rider on the clouds and stuff like that. Could it be that they stole, so to speak, from pagans, or could it be that there is a common theme that symbolizes and points to Yahweh because it's a powerful tool of polemics, which was a tool that the ancient people used among each other?
Yeah, that's pretty much what I argue in the book, that And again, this comes from scholars as well, where they note that even in the text itself, when you see, by the time they get out of Deuteronomy and you get into the book of Joshua, and they're in Canaan, you see the language about God change from versus when they're in Egypt and the Exodus and Deuteronomy and such. The language about God changes and becomes more storm god language. And you're right. That's exactly what goes on. Is you'll see the same language that was used of Baal in ancient Canaan is used by Yahweh towards I'm sorry, that is used by the Israelite writers of Yahweh. So it says, God rides a storm cloud. I already mentioned God, defeats Leviathan, the sea dragon. Well, the Canaanite storm god Baal was supposed to have defeated Leviathan himself and drank up the sea and all that. And so what Israel's doing is, oh no, does that mean syncretism? Are you saying that, the Jews just drew from pagan religions and just believe the same things and just changed it a little bit, so it evolves out of other religions? No, not at all. They use similar concepts to describe God. God's a rock and a mountain. I mean, there's all kinds of language that's used to describe God. And one of that is as the storm god, who conquers the seas and conquers the dragon. And that, and rides the clouds. So riding the clouds was a metaphor for deity, number one. Baal was a god. And secondly, it was that he was bringing judgment. Riding on the clouds is a metaphor for bringing judgment. And so you see the same terminology. Yahweh rides the clouds. In Isaiah, Yahweh rides the clouds against Egypt to judge Egypt. So what they're doing is they're not syncretistically sort of, accepting Canaanite religion and just evolving into something else. No. They're using similar imagery to say, basically, Baal is not the storm god who brings us rain and conquers the sea dragon. Yahweh is the storm god who created storms, creates rain, and conquers the sea dragon. So again, they're using this common imagery in the new context. They're now in the context. Where did they come from? The desert lands of Egypt. Now they're in the rainy, stormy land of Canaan. So they start to use storm language of God. This isn't syncretistic evolution of religion. It's just common cognitive environment. That's what John Walton, I got that from John Walton. I think he's done a lot of great work on this material in his books like The Lost World of Genesis and such. But it's a common cognitive environment of common symbols and imagery and such and such. And so, yeah, so there's that. But there's also, they demonize other beings. Like there's something interesting that goes on. Ashtoreth is a goddess in the Bible that is referred to. And it's interesting because Ashtoreth, there is no name of a Canaanite god called Ashtoreth. So what is this? Well, actually, the goddess was called Ashtart or Astarte, but Ashtart is the Philistine way of describing it, the goddess. And if you look what the Jews did, or the Hebrews who were writing the Bible, what they did was they took the name of Ashtart, and they didn't like saying the name because they don't like goddesses, right? They hate goddesses more than other gods, right? And so they used the vowels of the word for shame, Bosheth. They put the vowels for the word for shame and put them into the consonants for Ashtart, and it comes up with Ashtoreth. And so, in other words, they're mocking and degrading Ashtoreth by calling it a shameful thing, And there's a lot of word plays that go. The name for Jezebel, actually, Jezebel's name, we know what it is because we found, artifacts related to Tyre, and it was actually Isabel, which means where is the prince, and the bull Baal, which is Baal meant prince, and they worshipped Baal in Tyre. So where is the prince Baal? Isabel. Well, Zabel means dung, right? Excrement in Hebrew. So they changed the name from Isabel to Jezebel in the text to basically say like the queen of dung type of thing, right? And this is why at the very end of 2 Kings 9 it says the corpse of Jezebel shall always be as dung on the face of the field in the territory of Jezreel, so that no one can say this is Jezebel. So even the name Jezebel is really a deliberately twisted name in order to make a mocking judgment on it. So those are just a couple examples of how they interact with the pagan environment, and sometimes they mock it and play with the words, and sometimes they just use the same symbols, but they subvert them. So in my book, I explain what's subversion. So it's different than syncretism. Syncretism is when you try to combine your religion with another religion. That's what Rome did, right? Rome would say, well, you can worship any god you want, just also worship Caesar, and they would kind of consume all the other religions within it, right? So that's syncretism, but that's not what the Jews were doing. What they were doing was subversion, which is a different tact altogether. Subversion is when you use the common imagery and common symbols of a culture, you use them, but you invest them with new meaning and new definitions. Sometimes you explain it, sometimes you don't, because you're subverting, you're undermining the original ideas. That's the way you capture cultures, right? Look, the world does it to us. When you see movies and sometimes books, but certainly a lot of movies that tell the stories of Christian people, they'll often take the Christianity out of the movie and make it look like it's a humanist. Like what was it? Where story Broken? The movie Broken about the Christian Louis Zamperini, right? World War II and all this, and they pulled out the faith, so it's almost not even there. And yet, if you read the original book, it's like everything is about his faith, right? And so they are undermining our Christian stories and turning them into humanist stories. Well, they do the same thing to us, and God does the same thing to them. God takes their concepts and he undermines them with new meaning. And that's what I do as a storyteller as well. So that's why I've written stories where I rather than I believe Christians should be out there retelling the stories of the culture. We should be writing biographies of atheists like Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Freud and Darwin, because we need to reinterpret their life stories through our worldview and paradigm, give it new meaning. They're doing that to us all the time, right? Well, everybody does this. Even God does it. So I'm not just saying, oh, we can do this because other people are doing it. If God himself does it with Leviathan, with atonement, with all these things, then why don't we do it too? And I think that's just the nature of storytelling. It subverts. It uses the things that we're familiar with, the symbols and ideas and images, or genres, and it repackages them with new meaning. That's why, by the way, that's what they're doing right now with all the woke stuff in Hollywood, right? They're retelling Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs with a woke, she's not going to be kissed by a prince. The prince isn't going to save her. The dwarfs aren't small anymore. They're reinterpreting all these old stories in a new paradigm in order to communicate different values. And that's the danger. And we need to be doing the same thing right back to them. We need to be controlling the mythology as much as we possibly can.
Before we switch to how the ancient did see their universe, I just want to read two quick quotes, but very powerful one that you included in your book. First, you mentioned Francis Schaeffer, who said that the Christian is the really free man. He's free to have imagination. The Christian is the one whose imagination should fly beyond the stars. And I'm saying this when it comes to the whole topic of polemics and how we shouldn't have this disallowance or fear or a border or like or this like the borderline we shouldn't step because that's pagan and that's evil, it's dark. Rather we should use one of the tools or one of the terms or one of the objects or one of the themes that different people use, but we can sanctify them, so to speak. We can baptize them into Christ and Christianity and show them how certain things can lead us to Christ, point to Christ, or how it can be used in good sense. And in this sense, it's imagination. And I also want to read a quick quote by John Walton, who Dr. John Walton, whom you just mentioned. He used to be teaching at Moody just before I went to school. So basically, he says that borrowing, and here he means, supposedly the Bible borrowing from pagan accounts. He says the borrowing is not the issue. Likewise, this need not concern whose ideas are derivative. There is simply common ground across the cognitive environment of the cultures of the ancient world. So what I'm receiving, you wrote this on page 43, what I'm receiving here from Dr. Walton is that, hey, the ancients had common themes, common words, common cultures. For example, if I'm Eastern European, you said your origin is Polish. Imagine that you were born in Poland, and we gather some, people from other Eastern European nations, and let's say we gather around meal or we go and trade with each other. Inevitably, over the course of time, our people will get married, our customs will be exchanged, our beliefs will be mixed, our terms for so many different things will be used as a common theme, as something that we are sharing, even though in different nations, but we are sharing because of that same region of the world. For me, it makes perfect sense if the ancient Israelites lived in that geographical part of the world, and they share their values and their culture and their customs with other people. So of course, it makes perfect sense that we'll find so many similar things, not because they stole from each other, rather they had the same source, like for giants or like for the flood, but they
Yeah.
maybe use their own names, when it comes to certain characters, or maybe they will give some different parts of the story, but still all these sources, they should not confuse us and bring us into some conspiracy theory or someone stealing. Rather, hey, look at all these sources, they're talking about the same thing. How about this being true? How about this thing being something that unites us, rather than bringing like I said, conspiracy and trying to distort our belief as supposedly something being stolen. So I just appreciate that you included this couple of very powerful quotes in your book. Now we'll switch to chapter 4, where you're talking about the universe in ancient imaginations. So I think we can kick off by explaining what you mentioned, cosmography or cosmic geography. How did the ancient Israelites, how did they see cosmic geography, and why was this important for them?
Yeah, well, that's a very controversial issue still these days. Yeah, we don't really have time to really go too in depth in it since we're wrapping up here. But I do think that as people of their day, they saw the world like everybody else did. Just like in today's world, we see the universe or the cosmos in terms of post-enlightened physical material matter and forces, right? And we Einsteinian universe, and maybe in 100 years that would be disproved, and quantum physics and such. And if science is anything of a guide, we'll probably have a completely different view 200 years from now than we do now in terms of our cosmology. Well, the ancient world didn't have the scientific understanding that we had, and it had a different cosmology. And yeah, now look, there are different views, different kinds of views of cosmology, but there is also a sort of a dominant theme that you can there's enough overlap in these ideas to understand the basic cosmological view of the universe of the ancients was, a flat earth like a disc, and the waters go all around, and at the edge is is a dome. It's in a dome, like a snow globe. It's in a solid dome that the stars are fixed in the dome, and it goes around that earth. And there's 3 tiers. There's heaven, which is above the earth, and then the underworld below us. That's a very common notion. There are beliefs about it that aren't necessarily coherent, but they believe that there are pillars underneath the earth. Well, what are those pillars on? We're thinking our view in space. What are the pillars resting in space? No, they didn't have any concept of that. They didn't think it back that far. It's just, no, they're just on pillars. The earth is on pillars, and it goes down into the underworld, and the underworld's there. And sometimes they believed in the outside of everything was the abyss. And the abyss also came up and made connections in on the earth as well. You could enter the abyss from the earthly waters sometimes too. So this is a common ancient cosmology that many scholars have pointed out is also in the Bible. And that makes Christians freak out. Either A, you've got the hyper-literalist Christians who say, well, then the Bible's flat, because God says so. And there's just a real difficulty to talk to people who haven't really thought through things much. But then you have the other side where it's like, no, that's not saying it at all. And they reinterpret everything the Bible says, but there's so many passages that make references to these concepts of the circle of the earth. That's not a sphere. The word for circle is literally circle, like a disc, talks about the rakia, which is translated as firmament, but that's a bad translation. It's actually, the word is like a solid dome, that the sky is described as. And so the writers had this concept as they're describing God's glorious creation. Paul talked about it, right? In Philippians 2, the name of Jesus, every knee will bow in heaven, on earth, and under the earth. That's the 3-tiered universe, folks. And so the question becomes, well, there's other things too, but like I said, there's, I already described it. And there's, in my book, God Against the Gods, I do have a chapter where you can go and see all the Bible verses that describe these things, that create this concept of the dome around a flat earth and all this kind of stuff. Now, obviously what that means is then, does that mean the Bible's false and you can't believe anything the Bible says and the Bible's not scientifically accurate? And see, that proves it. The Bible, the Bible writers are uneducated. They don't know the truth, blah, 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 blah. No, it doesn't mean that at all. And those who believe in an inerrant Bible, well, does that mean the Bible is not inerrant? It's like, no, the inerrancy of the Bible is a reference to the rule for faith and the truth about God. And whatever worldview that the writers had is incidental. It's the context of what they're doing. So the Bible is true in what it teaches, but it's not teaching the flat earth with a dome. It's assuming the flat earth with a dome because that's how they see the world. But what it's teaching is God created this universe. And their imprecise way of describing that universe, by the way, we think we're more precise, but like I told you, 200 years from now, we're going to be proven wrong by our description of the universe. So the problem is that everybody's description is imprecise. The point is the Bible's not teaching science. It never was. And it's not teaching us, this is what the nature of the world is. It's describing, what it's teaching us is God created the universe. Now they understood it in these, Ptolemaic way or, the ancient, other ancient versions of it. But the point is they're not teaching science. The Bible's not teaching science. And so that's why I don't think you can understand the cosmological concept of the ancient world in the Bible and not have to sacrifice its inerrancy or its whatever, its trustworthiness, whatever word you want to use, because the Bible's not teaching that. It's just revealing the understanding of the writers, but they're not teaching us that. They're teaching us that God created the universe. Now we think the universe God created is quantum and quantum gravity rules, and it's all relative. God created all that, right? But like I said, 200 years from now, nope, that's all wrong. God created it this way. So the point is that God created it, whatever it is, and however we conceive of it, that's the truth, that God is the creator. We will never plumb the depths of creation it's beyond us. We can get deeper and we can understand some things, but we'll never know reality in and of itself. Only the stuff that God reveals to us about the unknown spiritual realm can we know, because he has to reveal it to us. But how much more, or just in the same way, not how much more, but in the same way, we can discover and learn about the universe and become better at it and more precise, but we're always learning and growing because we'll never understand reality in and of itself, because we are ourselves subjective creatures who are interpreting it, reality through reality as a medium. So we can never know it from God's perspective. We can only know it as to whatever degree that we can use God's faculties of reason and science to try to get more precise. But even reason and science changes over decades. And sometimes it's not, sometimes it's just a change of theory. It's not even, you think you're describing reality better, but not always. Sometimes it's just a different way to describe reality. You don't know that it's the truthful way to describe reality. So by the same token, so for us to look back on and say, well, they are, Bible's full of errors because they have a flat earth with a dome over it. So you think your modern view is more correct? Okay, you'll be disproven in 200 years. So I wouldn't be that arrogant as to presume that kind of that kind of godlike understanding of modern science, right? But it's true that I do believe that we have a more accurate picture in many ways of science than they did. But the key is to understanding that the Bible is not teaching science; it's teaching about God. And whatever imprecise understanding of science the writers had, they're very accurate and precise that God created the universe.
Brian, as someone who's been studying this topic and researching for years and decades, and you refer a lot in your books when it comes to these topics, you refer to very well-known scholars and theologians. Would it be fair to ask someone like you, hey, in your understanding and research and studies so far, especially the Old Testament, the whole Bible, but especially the Old Testament, would it be fair to say that the authors were not trying to say that the earth is old 6,000 years? They were not trying to say that the earth literally has four corners. They were not trying through genealogies to prove how old is the earth. They were not trying to explain plethora of things that we nowadays, like you said, if we read super literally, we can come up with all these different conclusions, like the earth is flat, the earth is shallow. Oh my God, could this be, and then people come with all these things of, conspiracies and stories. And then people argue sometimes in the same church. Good friends can argue about, I'm not saying these things are not important, but in your research so far, would you agree or not that the Old Testament authors, they were, instead of, like you said, instead of being scientific, they were trying to first show God's glory and majesty. Second, they were trying to show important theological messages, especially for a certain number. For example, in genealogies, in Matthew and Luke, was it number 14 that repeats often? So there is a message behind that, rather than, hey, put this together and count how old is the earth. Could it be that through some of these things, or like hell being under the earth, or like the angels being equated to the stars in heaven, could this rather be that they were trying to show God as the supreme king, ruler, and creator who has everything under his control, and that through a repetition of certain processes, numbers, symbols, the authors would actually try to connect all these different books of the Bible, like, for example, with gods, with demons, with whatever, and send a message to the people who are their contemporaries and to us nowadays. But because we're so much separated from that ancient context, because we were born thousands of years after that, could it be that we have misunderstood what the original authors in the Old Testament try to say? Not to show something like 2 and 2 and 4, but rather, hey, observe symbols, observe these numbers, observe patterns of repetition, and understand our message. Would you agree that this is rather the truth, and not like, oh, shape is like the earth of pizza, I don't care if it's, shape of pizza. I don't care if the earth is old gazillion years or 100 years. It seriously doesn't change or affect my faith at all. It doesn't affect my faith if we will land on the moon, or that's one of the NASA's supposedly, scams and conspiracies. I don't think they scammed or lied. And again, my faith and my worldview do not change for one bit. So would you agree, like the ancient people rather try to, through these symbols, numbers, and patterns, to show some theological messages rather than just being scientific and tell us, hey, this is how you must believe in this, scientific laws?
Yes. Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what I believe. And so we have to stop approaching the Bible, biblical text, as if it's a modern scientific or even historical text, because the way we do history is different than the way they did history in the ancient world. And we have to seek to understand within his ancient Near Eastern context first. And our goal should be to seek the meaning of the text. What are they trying to teach us? What's the meaning? What's the supernatural? What's the spiritual meaning that they're trying to communicate? That's not to say that it didn't happen. I'm not saying that at all. Yes, I believe the Exodus happened. Yes, I believe God parted the Red Sea. But what did that look like, and how did it? What really happened? Well, that we have to be open to the fact that the way we understand things now may not be the way that they were intending to communicate it back then. So we have to have a hermeneutic of humility. We have to stop imposing our own assumed hyperliteral, scientific, post-enlightened mindset on the text and start to first seek to understand what's the message behind it. And then, yes, we can explore things about, well, is this historical, or is this a legend, or is this a parable? Maybe, sometimes there are stories that are not said to be true or not. And you can't assume that they're literal. Like Job is a classic example. Job, it's been shown that Job follows the story structure of an ancient play. It could be a play. And so what if it is? Now, I believe it happened as far as I know. But what I'm saying is, if you study and find out that the genre is actually something you didn't realize, it doesn't change the meaning of the text, does it? And that's, that doesn't therefore mean, everything's myth and nothing really happened. No, that's ridiculous, because that's not how literature is written. And there's clearly, the Bible is written over thousands of years, hundreds of authors, whatever, dozens of authors. And so you can't just say everything's the same, because it's not. So there is some things that are literal history, and there is some things that are metaphorical and symbolic history. And there are some things that we don't even know the genre. And so, we just have to approach the text with more humility than I think we have. And modern Christians are very guilty of imposing this sort of like, whatever the text literally says, by my modern understanding, that's it. And everybody else is a liberal. If you don't believe this, you're a liberal. You don't believe the Bible because you don't believe it the way I believe it. It's like, that's so ridiculous that only a fool could think that way. And so we have to be careful about when we're approaching that, and the assumptions we make when we're saying something. I get this a lot from people, where they're just, well, I believe the Bible literally. You don't. It's like, no, you don't believe the Bible literally. You don't believe that the dragon in Revelation is literal, do you? No, it's symbolic. So you don't believe the Bible's all literal. We all realize that the Bible is full of some literal truths, some metaphorical, some imprecise truths. There's some textual transmission problems with it. So we understand that there's all kinds of factors that we have to really approach the text from a more cautious way. And that's being humble with the text and letting the Bible and its original context take priority over our agenda. That's my goal.
Thank you, Brian. We're almost done for tonight. I just want to explain for the viewers who are not very familiar with some theological phrases. You mentioned hermeneutics a couple of minutes ago. I just want to explain to people that this is the art of interpreting the Bible. And on page 70, Brian, you wrote that sometimes science can correct our interpretation of the Bible. And I would also quote Dr. Hugh Ross, whom I had 2 Sundays ago, who always says repeatedly in his books, but also on many of his YouTube videos, he says how God gave us 2 books, the books of the Bible as the scriptures, but he also gave us the book of the nature, and these two
Yeah.
perfectly are harmonized and work together. So some people, like you said, they may call you a liberal just because on page 70 you wrote that science can help us interpret Bible better than if we will literally take four corners of the earth,
Yeah.
or IKEA as something existing in the clouds, therefore no space rocket can ever leave the earth. But no, rather, if we read the Old Testament in this context of how the ancients saw the universe, and many scholars are saying repeatedly over and over again, God did not bother trying to fix their science, because he had this salvific plan, right? He was not bothered so much with how they understood the universe. So I just want to say that do not, to all the viewers, not to mock people who may be coming in your pulpit, sitting with you, eating bread with you, taking communion, worshiping God with you. Do not think they hate God, or they're spreading heresies and false doctrines, or being liberal just because they read certain genres of the Bible. And by the way, God created all these different genres, and he's using all the
Yeah.
authors of the Bible in their own mindset and creativity to use their own personality and genres they chose to. So do not think for a second that just because you read certain portions of the Old Testament, that's the only way how to read them, especially if you didn't spend tons of time in the library, or at least buying and ordering books and trying to understand more about this ancient perspective. So for me, this was a wonderful reminder how science just means knowledge. Science is a Latin word, scientia, which just means knowledge. This is a God-given tool which we can observe compared to the Bible, and can
Yeah.
help us, understanding the scriptures. So the two are never at war with each other. It can be scientism, or how some people interpret the Bible, versus how some people interpret the science. But in actuality, Bible and science, they go hand in hand. Brian, it's been 2 hours. Thank you so much for your time. I just want to give you a minute or two for your concluding thoughts. If you want to share something, either
Thanks, Nicola.
book or in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah. So, yeah, if you want to read my book, really all my books are exclusively on Amazon in paperback, Kindle, some hardback, and audiobook. And I have a lot of them. You can go there and get all the information about them that you want, that you can. If you want to go to my website, I created a website that I wanted to be very informative and helpful to anybody who was interested. So it's interesting. It's not a boring website. That's Godawa.com, Godawa.com. And while there, you can find all kind of information on all my books as well. But yeah, I would just say Amazon, I have book descriptions so you can find out what they're all about. And there's an author page for Brian Godawa that has all the books. So, go there and you could get a good description, but go to my website if you want also other scholarly articles that talk. I have lists of free scholarly articles that address all these things we're talking about, to kind of show the backing for what I'm saying. But it'll also give you an introduction to the fictional series that I have. And yeah, so that's where you can get all the info on me.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I hope sometimes in the future we can do another episode on one of the other books that you wrote and which I also bought, but we simply do not have all the time available. So I'm looking forward to work together again in the future. I just want to encourage our viewers to keep studying and digging, and just having this beautiful, curious mind filled with imagination, and just be ready for God to surprise you with so many things that you are about to learn if you're just open-minded. And by the way, at the end of this video's description, I put Brian's website and the Amazon link to all of his books. He has wonderful, like this is a theology book, but the books that he's mentioning and you see the posters behind him are novels. So I posted the links for all of those books. Support Brian and his wonderful work. And I wish all of you a wonderful holiday and a blessed week. Thank you, and God bless.